session of our onboarding series for the new registrars and admissions directors. I know that the reason I wanted to start off with this session is when I asked everyone for the sessions they really wanted, RDS was the first one that everyone said. So I wanted to start off with RDS because I know that's an ongoing process for you, and that's a policy that you really want information on. And so I asked Gene Ritter, who's presenting for us today, thank you, Mr. Ritter, if he would go ahead and do that first for our first onboarding. Going forward, I'll send out sessions to you all. I think we're going to look at audit. We're going to do sessions on audit. What are the first top 10 audit findings? We're going to do sessions on the difference between state board code and local policy. And we're also going to do some sessions on what is a day in the life of an admissions and registrar. And so we're going to ask some of our seasoned registrar and admissions directors to come in and give you information on, what does a year look like in the life of a registrar and admissions director, and what are some of the screens you need to know, what are some of the reports that you need to make sure you have and know about, and what's some of the contacts you need to have. So those are some of the onboarding sessions you're going to have. So once we get those scheduled and get those to deliver those, I'll send that out to you. But if you have any questions or there's something that I mentioned that you want in addition to what I mentioned, please send me an email. Let me know if there's something you think is really burning with you and you want some kind of overview or clarification on. Let me know, and I'll make sure we deliver that to you. Miss Sonia Barley also said she's willing to provide some sessions to you because I know colleague is a big thing right now, and so she's willing to do that also. So just let me know whatever you need. And I'll make sure I try to provide it to you as our new administrators at our campuses. I did schedule 2 hours for this session. It probably won't take 2 hours, more than likely, but I want to make sure you had enough time to get your questions answered from Mr. Ritter. And so just so you know, this is your session. This is for you. We don't expect you to know all this stuff. We know that it's new to a lot of you, so please don't feel afraid or bashful about asking questions at all. If it doesn't make sense, jump in and ask him, for clarification, because if you have that question, I guarantee you someone else does. And we want to make sure that this is as beneficial to you as possible to make sure that it makes your job easier. So with no further ado, I'm going to step out of the way and get started. I'm going to put myself on mute because they're doing your work in the background that you can hear it. So, but with that being said, Mr. Ritter, I will hand the ball off to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So good morning. I see a couple familiar names, but a lot of new ones. My name's Gene Ritter, and I'm the residency program manager for SEAA, and I'm going to talk about roles in a minute. But a lot of you are new. My background, I actually came into these positions from the community college system. So I've done those positions. I've been the admissions director, I've been a registrar. Actually, years ago, started out my career teaching. I still teach part-time at a community college. So I've been there, understand that. What I'm trying to do this morning is tailor this to your unique roles and your unique needs. Some of you are brand new, and I'm going to give you hopefully a big overview. There's a lot of content here, but I'm going to give you resources, and you also have access to live people to help you with this process. So don't be afraid, but I want to give you the big picture. I'm kind of condensing this down into, in the past, we've had 2 separate presentations, one kind of on the basics of residency requirements in law, and then one on campus roles and responsibilities or campus-based exceptions. So I'm going to try to give you an overview, and then we'll give you resources and go from there. So we're going to look at what does the law say basically about residency, some common helpful hints, both at your end and for the students, what their experience is like, and then at the campus side, once the determination has been made, what's your role and how do you process that and work with the student? So like every other state, North Carolina has laws to provide for a lower tuition rate for its residents um, at state-funded institutions. So that part is not unique. And in many ways, it's similar to other states. In some ways, it's a little more stringent. And in other ways, actually, there are a lot more provisions that benefit the student than in other states. I'll try to highlight that. Prior to 2013, this was all done on a campus per campus basis. The basic laws about who qualifies to be a resident for tuition purposes were put into place in the mid 70s and really haven't changed substantially since then. The biggest revision was in the 80s to carve out a special exception for active duty military stationed in North Carolina who claimed another state as their home. The other changes since then have been minor and have to do with little exceptions here and there. But the biggest thing that happened was in 2013, the legislature decided that it was in everyone's best interest to have one centralized determination process. Prior to that, all colleges and universities had to make their own. And what happened during that legislative session is there were more than one member of the legislature who actually had a son or daughter going through the process and had very different experiences at different institutions that they were responding to, or applying to several. Some of them merely just said, do you swear that you are? And that was it. Others, sent a 20-page booklet to fill out, requested copies of lots of documents, and they felt it was not consistent. And some of them actually got different determinations at different institutions. At the same time, just to make you aware, I understand this is different for a community college student, but the one service provides also for the college, the private for grants, but also for the public universities, which have a lot of students from out of state wanting to come here and apply. And historically, a lot of them have found ways kind of to sneak in the back door. They're unlike the community college system. They have a rigid admissions process, and they actually have legal quotas that they cannot accept more than a certain percentage of those who are out of state residents. And if a problem's discovered after the fact, that could penalize the university. So we serve all sectors. But the other thing that was noticed is during that period of time, there was actually a third party, private, that for a fee would guarantee an out-of-state family that they basically had enough students going through systems. They found ways to beat the system. And you would pay them a 4-figure fee and they would guarantee you in state within a year. So that all went to the legislature and kind of boiled over. And so that's how we ended up with one centralized service at this point. So the residency determination services, that service is managed like a lot of our programs and state grants by College Foundation. You'll also see CFNC. It's a collaborative effort with all the sectors in terms of reaching out to try to prepare students to apply for and attend college. The actual residency program, however, the statutory authority was given to SCAA by the legislature to run the program, which we contract out to RDS. I actually worked on the CFNC side as part of implementation and was the operations supervisor for a number of years before coming to this position. So we provide the policy guidance, write the official documents, are there to consult with RDS. RDS does the, at CFI, the day-to-day operations. So some of the basics that residency law says you have to have the legal capacity to establish a resident. For example, someone age 16 as a minor doesn't have the ability to establish an independent resident of their parent. And the intent must be that it's a domicile. That means your primary permanent residence. You can have more than one home. Only one by law can be primary. Good example here in North Carolina is we have a lot of people that have a secondary home on the beach or the mountains, or they own a piece of property. The law looks at what does the majority of your documents point to? Where are you day to day? Where's your license? Where are your vehicles? Where do you pay taxes as your domicile? And that we look at the actions you take. So if someone moves here and it's truly permanent, you expect they're eventually going to change their driver's license. They have employment here. Did they register to vote? Are they paying taxes? But there's a host of types of documents, or things we would look at. Is the person on Medicaid? Are they receiving food stamps from North Carolina versus another state? The other requirement is you have to hold that domicile for at least 12 months. Okay. And basically what happens is the students going through is if it looks like someone's always been here, that's kind of the end of it. It looks like they moved here. We start looking a lot more closely at, has it been 12 months? Have you met the duration requirement? The statutes also assume that, the younger the person is, that you are based, you are domiciled where your parent or guardian is, unless they can show they're independent. And again, this is probably more on the UNC side, but we have a lot of students who move here, and after 1 year, to their mind, to go to a university, to their mind, I've been here a year, why can't I get in state? Well, it's not just being here, it's at that point, are they living in a dorm? That's not a permanent residence. Or are the parents basically still financing them, that they're dependent on them? They have no income, they have no financial aid on their own merit, that kind of thing. So those are the things we look at if someone has moved to North Carolina or they're trying to, the parents are not present. There are a lot of special provisions carved into law, and RDS screens for this, that if you're a ward of the state, in other words, in foster care, if you're married, we're not going to look at a parent at that point if they've been orphaned, emancipated minors. If someone's lived long-term with one or more adult relatives in North Carolina, we can use that even if the parents are in another state. Those are carved into law, and RDS screens for all of these things for you. There are, for some non-residents, carved into law, and I alluded to this one, some special situations where for a non-resident, they could be charged the in-state tuition rate. And the biggest exception you're going to see is for active duty military stationed in North Carolina, including a spouse and dependents if they're here with them, that are claiming another state as their permanent residence, but they're here. They can get what we call the out-in. They're out-of-state resident because they don't meet the legal requirements, but there's a provision to give them in-state tuition. And they can actually keep that for the duration of their enrollment in the same program at the same college, even if the service member gets transferred. Same with National Guard. North Carolina National Guard, most of them are going to qualify as residents, but we have a few that live across the border in Virginia or South Carolina. As long as they're active with the Guard, they can get a tuition exception. Generally, we encourage people, if they meet the regular requirements, go that way. Don't take the exceptions because the exceptions require some monitoring and some work on your part. So RDS will go ahead and determine these because there's no other requirement. Some other exceptions we're going to get into, the campus has to handle because there's a requirement. For example, a veteran has to have been awarded each academic term. There's no way for us to know future will that happen. So, or there's an employer exception. So we'll look at that. We'll come to the campus exceptions a little later. So RDS screens as much as we can for the campus that doesn't require the campus to verify something, that's time limited. So this campus-based, again, we're going to come back into more detail, but again, when you have these exceptions, it's the tuition rate. They're still a non-resident. That residency definition hasn't changed since the 70s. And they're ones that have to be evaluated at the campus. This is why it's important. While there may be a tuition exception in some cases prescribed in law, they're not eligible for state grants. The laws pertaining to state grants says you have to meet that residency requirements, and it will not recognize the tuition provision. You have to be a regular bona fide resident of North Carolina to get state grants for the most part. There's very few exceptions, and it has to do with the private sector. So what's RDS's role? RDS provides all residency determinations. Campuses don't have the ability to make a residency determination, but you can see if they qualify for a tuition exception. RDS also provides for evaluation of eligible immigration statuses. And let me say that this is one of the more complex issues. Be thankful you don't have to deal with it day to day. It's a big part of what I have to look at on, some of these complicated cases. But compared to other states, we take a lot of immigration statuses that other states will not as being eligible for in-state tuition. Okay, basically, and we have consulting immigration attorneys that have worked with residency for a number of years with us. And basically, unless the Immigration Services classifies their visa as not eligible to establish a residence, for example, a visitor here for 3 months, they're here, they're lawfully present, but they can't establish a residence. Or a student on an F1 study visa that says part of the condition is you're claiming you are maintaining a permanent residence in another place, and you have so many days at the end of study you have to leave the country. So they're not able. This is quite a benefit for our students because federal financial aid, for example, you have to be a permanent resident, a refugee, asylee, or there's one visa type we'll take. When you go to the RDS guidebook, you see there's a long list of visa types that are eligible for in-state tuition. RDS will screen for all of that for you. There's a lot of special situations I mentioned earlier built in. RDS will screen for this. If someone says we're the state, we'll collect that document showing, okay, we don't need to look for a parent if they've been orphaned and so forth. If there's split families, we look at that. There's provisions. Basically, if one of the parents is here and their biological parent and they're here with them, that will work, even if it's in some cases less than 12 months. It gets very complicated, but we'll screen for all of this. And as I mentioned, the tuition exceptions that don't require anything else, the active duty military and North Carolina National Guard for the non-residents will screen for that and certify eligibility. They don't have to use a benefit. So that's why we're able to give a blanket approval for that in-state tuition. So RDS will validate and collect any necessary documentation, which, by the way, initially, I mean, if they come to an appeal, it could be different, but we request, very few students are requested a document anymore. Probably about, I think last October, we looked at this during the college app season, and it was something like 5 to 8%, somewhere in there. It's only things we can't do electronically. But the campus does not, okay, have to collect documents on any residency determination, only for something campus. I see there was a question about veterans. Yes, I'll come back to it a little later, but veterans, by the fact that someone was a mere veteran, does not give them in-state tuition. They must have and be awarded a benefit. If that benefit is not available, or they choose not to use it, or they use it up, they would revert to out of state if they don't meet the requirements. And that's just being in compliance with federal law. Okay. So unless you're doing a campus-based exception, you don't need to collect documents on anything that RDS does, or there's some other reason for financial aid or something that you need it. So some tips is students will sometimes try to come through at 18 saying, I want to be independent. If their parents are not here in North Carolina and they're trying to, say, well, I'm 18 now and can I just qualify? Basically, the law says you have to have had the capacity, which they don't until 18, and then once you establish it, hold it for 12 months. So generally, and I say generally because there's some exceptions we'll screen for, like married, you're not going to be independent till you're 19 at the earliest, and then you have to show financial if the parents have been supporting them. You show that they're able to support themselves. This is a big one, is that they don't have to be living under the same roof as the parent. As long as we can verify a parent is a North Carolina resident, they're good to go. This is very different from what happens when they're in high school, for example. You've heard of McKinney-Vento Act. They certify a lot of students. Basically, if you are not living under the same roof as a parent, you can be classified as homeless or unaccompanied. They could have been living last 10 years with their grandmother or aunt, uncle, whomever. By our definitions, post-secondary, that we might have other ways to qualify based on the parent or based on the adult, but they don't have to be living with the parent. So we've had situations where student's parent was incarcerated. We have ways of verifying that and approving them. They're done. It's often easier than trying to have them show independence when they have no income. RDS system can accommodate a lot of those scenarios, these special circumstances. Okay. So the interview really gets into that. Finally, one of the biggest problems we have is students just either in a hurry, they don't know the information at the time, they rush through it, they just skip all these questions. It's better they stop, save where they are, they can pick up at the same place later and return, because, you know, if basically you skip all the questions, we're going to assume you don't have any documents showing you're in North Carolina, maybe you just got here. So the student's experience, this functions very much like an online, like TurboTax or something like that, a tax interview. It uses skip logic. So for example, the first question is, are you a resident of North Carolina? Are you claiming eligibility for tuition purposes? If, for example, you're living in Pennsylvania and want to come to school here and you know you're not going to meet it, you could say, no, you're done. You get your number, you're finished. Now, the student can come back at any time and it tells them, you know, if something's changed and get a determination. That would be the shortest. It asks you a series of questions, and depending on your responses, it takes you to different modules. There's not one, you know, clear path that everyone takes. So if you're not a US citizen, you're going to get immigration questions about what your immigration status is. If you are not a resident, but you're active duty military station here, it's going to take you that module and you're pretty much done. So it depends. Are you claiming that you're a dependent of your parents? Are they both here? So depending on the scenario, it's going to do that. What the system does is it starts asking, for example, do you have a driver's license? Do you have a vehicle registration? Are you registered to vote? Are you employed in North Carolina? Have you paid state taxes? Do you have Medicaid? Do you have food stamps? And the list goes on. And the system, after several yes, I do, what it will do is, excuse me here, basically stop when it thinks it has enough information to validate and will not have you continue on. However, it will keep going if you say no to everything and virtually exhaust every possibility we could think of rather than giving them an out of state. Okay. A great thing about the system is we've tried to make this that it's done electronically so that the student's not having to submit documents except in unusual cases with sensitive information. So for example, if you say, yes, we have a driver's license or vehicle, you give us one of those numbers. Yes, we paid North Carolina taxes. Basically, the system pings those agencies and a response comes back about, yes, they've had a driver's license for at least 1 year, or yes, they paid taxes. We don't see the tax return. We don't know how much they made, but it will tell us whether they filed as a resident or not. We have some people that say, for example, work across the border in another state and they're working here, but they live in another and they file as a non-resident. So there are very few things that we have to collect a document on as basically military immigration or something involving a quarter. Now, if the information doesn't validate and the student says it's wrong and I have information to the contrary, they can come back to us in reconsideration appeal and then at that point submit documents for us to review. Just so you know, this is one of the many, many tools available on our public website. This compares the information RDS asks for with what's on the FAFSA. It's pretty similar. It really is. We will ask more about the immigration, okay, information, because we have more eligible statuses. And we're more interested in the state tax return of, are you declaring that you are a resident? Let's see here. There was a question about, so some of this is getting into detail, but let me try to answer quickly. So in the profile, you have to have a unique ID. Social, you can use a TIN number, you can use an immigration number, okay? So it doesn't have to be a social. There are several options in there for the student. It's preferred because a lot of agencies use that for validation, but I mean, it gives them several other options. We do need some unique identifier. So for example, if they have a US immigration number, that's fine. If they have a TIN instead of a social, that's fine. Student under age for so this is, you've got FAFSA and you have RDS, and there's some similarities, but there's some differences in criteria. It is not hard and fast about 24, but generally we follow the same. We're going to assume at that point you're more likely to be independent. So we never check the parents' income. It's just, are they residents? The only time we're looking at income is if the student is telling us they want to be considered independent, okay? And we don't find at a glance evidence that they are. We will look at any financial aid they get that's not co-signed loan. We will look at any employment they have. At that point, we might ask for the student, but we never ask for income of the parent because we're looking again at residency versus financial aid. Hope that helps with that. Okay, so there are, by the way, a lot of other one-pagers like this on the public website for students, parents, counselors, students in special circumstances, what to do if you've experienced homelessness, what to do if you're a U.S. citizen and the parents don't want to share their social, or they may be undocumented. It gives them a lot of pointers of how to navigate the system. Several of those documents have been translated into Spanish. Okay, but the information is pretty similar to what we're asking for. Okay, next. The student will get email reminders if they have an in-progress application or they owe a document, okay? They will get a total of 4 different messages at different times letting them know they have 25 days to submit any document. So, or if they haven't submitted their application, it's still in progress, and it gives them deadlines and reminds them at the end of this, you know, it's going to close it out and you would have to come back and start over again. So they get that. Likewise, the students can log in their account at any time and see a dashboard. It tells them where things are. So this has been validated, you know, and so forth. If the blue is informational, if they owe a document, they will get a red text area and it will tell them, for example, we're still waiting for the document showing that you're assigned to a duty station in North Carolina military base, or we're still waiting for your immigration document. The students also from the dashboard, if they disagree with something or need a new determination, they have a button they can push and it walks them through that process and gives them options. So at any time they can log in and see what the status is. The student's experience, everyone starts out with what we call initial consideration. It puts them through that interview. And for probably the majority of our students, that's kind of the end of it. If they get out of state, there's a couple of options, and the system will walk them through the difference. A reconsideration or an appeal. They could jump directly to an appeal. Reconsideration is for students who maybe it timed out, they didn't submit the document in time, maybe they came through 6 months ago and hadn't met the 12 duration requirement, hadn't met that, and now they do. It will allow them to provide that. And like the initial consideration, if everything, you know, works out and everything validates with agencies and whatnot, that might be the end of it. The system may automatically assign a determination. If necessary, reconsiderations and appeals in particular always come in for a staff member to review if you know, it doesn't look like they're eligible for in-state. Okay. Appeal is, it doesn't put them through the whole interview. They basically say, I don't have anything new to give you. I've told you everything, but I think it's wrong, or I have special circumstances. It's very rare that we have, it happens, but something so unique or so special the interview doesn't catch it, but it has happened. So, but the system will walk them through that. Once you get to the appeal level, it immediately goes and is assigned to a staff member who works with the student one-on-one. They simply fill out a one-page form. If the student had more information, it's better to do reconsideration because the appeal doesn't put them through all that again. And then we may be asking for documents that could have been validated electronically. At the end of that process, that appeal process, the student, by the way, has the option of Speaking with the appeals committee, if it looks like they're going to be out of state, they notify them that, or they let them know what the issues are. The student can request a hearing in front of the committee and make their case. That can be done in person, video, or phone. At the end of that process, if the student gets out of state, there's one last level of appeal, and that's to SCAA. And we get very few of these. I mean, like the last 2 quarters, we've had 2 students. At that point, the student cannot present any new information. They simply write up, and the sole grounds are that RDS, there's something in the guidebook or law that they feel RDS didn't make the right determination. In spite of that, I will tell you that, most of these are coming from students who have been here going to the university for a year or 2, and they're trying to get in state and argue for it. But most of them are students that just don't agree. Like, I don't agree with the 12 months, or I don't think it's fair that, my immigration status can't, or lack thereof, can't allow me to get in state. That's the most common. It's rare that we get, something else, but very few. So there are several levels there. The student's unique situation can be reviewed. What are the top reasons that they come back and it didn't work in the initial? Well, number one, just coming back to even finish, I forgot my login and password. RDS has put in a lot more. They always had the option of creating security questions to retrieve it. A lot of them didn't, but they have some other helps that have built in that have really, the number has gone down, but that was by and large more than 50–60% of the calls to our call center. We have a unique call center dedicated to students going through the interview or process to help them figure out next steps or answer questions. The next most common reason is they don't key in the information correctly. Believe it or not, some of them type their name in wrong, or social, or date of birth. The date of birth and social, we ask for to enter it twice. A lot of them, unfortunately, enter the wrong one twice. So, I mean, we take that face value until we try to validate. Next is skipping too many questions. Either they don't have it in front of them and they just say, well, I told you I live here. I gave my driver's license. That's enough. RDS is not going to validate on one item only. Some of them just make up information. If they're over 18, they want to be independent, they've got to show, financial independence if parents are in another state. Again, parents are here and we can look them up, we'll look them up. Those are the most common by far. In terms of, we have a dedicated campus line for assistance so that you can reach someone on the processing team right away. And I'll give you that information at the end, as well as my contact information for policy questions. These are the top calls we get. What's the status? You can look at it up to a degree and maybe not all the details you want. Asking why they got non-resident. The student a lot of times will say, I don't know. They can always call in and discuss in detail, but they do get a general sense. Having problems pulling it into the colleague system. You're running, you get an error message. Most of the time it's on the colleague system, but I mean, they'll probably refer to me because RDS is not familiar with all the systems. Of course, UNCs use different systems. The private universities use different ones. So I can usually help troubleshoot that. Verifying the effective date, looking at the history, seeking guidance on a variety of policy issues, especially campus exceptions. Those are probably going to come to me. Those get a little complicated. Those are the typical calls we get. If you look at the bottom left, this kind of gives you an idea of what happens. The determinations are out there on 2 servers that RDS makes, and the community college system through colleague pulls them in batches. Your IT locally decides how that's done. Typically for most people, it's once overnight to pull in, the determinations of new students coming in. Okay. You also have the ability to pull them in one-off, that XRDO process. Okay. And if you're not familiar with it, there are a couple of documents out there on the in your resource site issued by the system office about residency and how to troubleshoot problems in colleague. You may want to get a hold of those and the whole workflow about that. But you do have that XRDO process where you can pull on one off. So if a student says, I just got off the phone with RDS, they just approved my, appeal, you can go ahead and pull that in. So your college system reaches out either way to this Crossroads server we use. There's also a cross-connect one-off lookup. And again, you'll get details on these in the campus manual where you could look up and see one-on-one if the application is pending, what's going on with it, and what information is tied to it. When RDS makes the determination, it simultaneously pushes in pretty much real time to that Crossroads server and to the grant system. And the workflow for UNC is pretty similar. Private independent colleges, universities don't pull them in because they don't deal with pulling this in for every student admitted, only students requesting grants. So their financial aid kind of takes a different path with it. So when part of the process to bring this system up, there were several years of a collaboration. There's a committee of administrators from all the sectors, from community college, from UNC system, from the private independent, working with CFI and CFNC and SEAA to what would the system look like, to see everyone's needs were met. And part of the discussion was, if the student gets a determination, how long should it be valid? And there was concerns that, for example, a student came through when they were, junior or senior in high school that, and hasn't attended and now seeks to enroll 3 years later. How do we know the family didn't move? What's a valid time frame? And they came up with 15 months, and I can explain why, but that it's going to be valid to enroll. We now have automated something that's been very helpful because students, for example, might be attending somewhere and then during the summer or at one point want to go take one class on another college campus or online. And if that had expired, even though it was good for them to be enrolled at the same institution, the new institution could pull it. So what we've done to extend them is the reports that you or some other unfortunate person at your campus is filing regularly, the attendance reports with Clearinghouse, okay, is that we ping Clearinghouse twice a year. And if it shows they were enrolled on any campus in North Carolina, it's automatically pushing out the expiration date. And that expiration date, again, is only for new enrollments. Once they're enrolled and stay continuously enrolled, they don't have to come back to RDS unless they see a need or you're questioning something. So it's automatically doing both. It will not do any exceptions like those out in the military, and it will not for time-limited visa students, and we'll talk about that. But most of your students, if they have a social that they've provided, it will automatically keep extending them so that even like, let's say they're at a 4-year, they're in their senior year, they need a class, so they come to your campus, can I take it this summer or take it online, that they would still be covered and not have to come back. So that's been huge in terms of driving down the numbers of students having to come back. So let's talk a little bit about the campus. So we've talked about RDS, what happens at that end, the student's experience. So you're going to be responsible for looking at any campus-based tuition exceptions. We're going to talk about those. There are a small number that have to be tracked for time limit eligibility, okay, including at your campus. So some of these exceptions we're going to look at are pretty much, they're all written into law and the details, and there's a campus guide to guide you through each one of these, but some of them say basically it's open-ended, and as long as they meet the criteria, they can keep it. Other ones, for example, are tied to 1 year period. You can only have that exception for a year, so you'd have to track if you're giving that exception. For those that are active duty military or National Guard, those are usually longer term, and they can keep them if they're continuously enrolled. Visa is a little different. We'll come back to that. I'm going to talk about these others later. So basically, any exception you're granting at a campus level, you're responsible for reviewing and keeping documentation. Okay. And then there's a couple of tracking cases. So looking at those campus-based exceptions, so these apply to students who were deemed to be a non-resident. They didn't meet the requirements for whatever reason, including duration. But there are carved into law some sector-specific exceptions and some general ones for both UNCs and community colleges. So in the campus base, there's several, again, tuition exceptions. They have to be handled because of the eligibility requirements. Early on, I talked about the ones RDS handles. It's all you have to do is be stationed here, for example. That's it. These others have some other eligibility that has to be monitored each term. It's tied to some other factor. They never change the residency status. So effectively, it's like that out-of-state resident but in-state tuition that RDS gives. You can grant the in-state tuition, you code them in colleague, and it will recalculate the tuition. So there are a couple exceptions that can be given at any North Carolina college university. One is the veterans exception and statutory grace period. We'll talk about that one. Others are specific to either UNC system or North Carolina Community College system. So let's take the veterans. These are, if the person meets residency requirements, RDS is going to try to put them that way. That way you're not dealing with exceptions in terms of tuition billing. You know, they're in, they're done like any other student. But under federal law, if they use certain types of benefits, which would be most of your veterans, if they have it, award it, and use it, then there's a provision that they have to be adjusted to North Carolina tuition rate. So you need to run that through your financial aid, VA certifying folks, and show the award. We had a student a number of years ago that came through, was the service member, former service member, who had just moved to North Carolina 2 months before, wanted to attend a community college, but didn't want to use his benefit. You know, went to the governor's office, went to attorneys, and everyone came back with, you know, this is what federal law says. If you want the exception, you use the benefit. You can attend, but to get the exception, you've got to have it and use it. So your VA folks will certify that, and for any term, the award's there. If they lose the award, it's not just that they were a veteran or a dependent or spouse, they have to have and use a benefit. I'll come back to this grace period in a minute. Okay, again, I stress that because there's a lot of misunderstanding. You know, we've had people that the individual was not assigned a benefit by the service member. It has to be assigned by the service member. You know, unfortunate, but there's not much we can do. And there's where, you know, simply we're following what's prescribed in federal law. And the idea is they're supposed to be establishing residency, by the way, that they are, it's supposed to help them that first year. Some of them, I'm not sure they ever do. If they do and they meet it, send them back to RDS so you won't have to keep tracking the tuition exception. And there's where you look at your local and best practices, and Sonia and others can help you about end dating some of these exception codes, that it's not there forever, you know, when maybe their eligibility expired. So other community college sector specific, you know, business sponsor students, that is a North Carolina business or entity is sending someone for training and they are directly paying the college on their check for 100% of the cost. It can be adjusted. When you have a business military transfer families, if it's military and it's active duty, you probably better send them to RDS, because this one, all of these are detailed in a campus guide, which you're going to get a copy of. Okay. Each one of these, but that one has a cap of how many you can approve, you know, and it can't be more than, I think it's 1% of your out-of-state enrollment. So it's a very small number. And I think it's for a year. So anyway, these all have very specific things in there. Certain non-citizen public high school graduates, if they were lawfully admitted, and you know, there's where this gets very complicated, and you know, we can help you when you come across some of these, but that campus guide will look at that. That would help someone, for example, who's a non-citizen. You had to have been lawfully admitted. So they had a visa, it expired, and they are, and I apologize for the noise because they're working outside my living room. It expired, but they were lawfully admitted. It's permissible to give a waiver. Refugees, this will help with that first year of duration issue. So here's a group of others. I won't go through all of these. The last one is actually a UNC sector specific. They only have two. If it's an eligible full-time employee, their families, it was decided a number of years ago that the system office, their community college system office, would honor this. Again, it's specified in the campus responsibility guide, but it's not every employee. We have a lot of students who are work study trying to use that. No, it has to be an eligible full-time employee. And the idea behind that was, let's say someone's hired to teach at a university, family moves here in August, that would help them that first year with duration, because they still have to be residing in North Carolina and working toward residency. But again, each one of these have very specific requirements that are detailed. But these are the kinds of things a campus can look at and certify. Probably not a large number. You may get some of the UNC system, but on the other hand, they do get some free tuition at their end, so probably not as many as you think. So for those campus-based tuition exceptions, if it has an eligibility time requirement, you have to track that. And then again, look at, end dating those exception types and reviewing them. So if you make any kind of campus decision, at that point, you need to collect any documentation to show why it was granted when they're an out-of-state student. If the student, especially if they've been there for a while, you can always ask them to return to RDS for new determination if we think they can meet the criteria now. This way it would eliminate your having to track and to do all of that. So the tracking, any one of those benefits is time limited, you have to track. For RDS purposes, there are three things you have to look at. And we jump to the other two, the active duty military and the non-resident North Carolina National Guard. That's only someone not living in North Carolina, but is drilling here. I think we've only ever had like 18 or 20 go through since we went live. It's a tiny number, and more likely if you're in, near one of the borders, South Carolina, Virginia. Basically, active duty is going to be the largest one, but as long as that student is continuously enrolled in the program, even if that parent or the service member gets transferred, they're okay. So you're looking at them graduating, stopping out, or changing to a totally different program. Otherwise, they'd be, they're good to go. The National Guard have long-term contracts. Usually you're talking about 8 years, 6 years. The one that is a little trickier, but not a large, huge number. Most of our non-citizens have a green card or permanent residence. That's basically permanent by immigration's definition. Even though the card may have an expiration, they try to combat forgery by changing the design. Those don't have to be tracked. We've come up with a new code that's been released that these records get flagged with that and a tracking date. The code you will get in that campus guide, charts with codes and so forth, basically is non-immigrant tracking. And it's visas and what we call temporary protected status. These have a definite time frame, and there's no guarantee they're going to be renewed. So those RDS will pass on a tracking date, an expiration date. So if the student comes through today and their visa expires October 1st, it's going to be flagged as October 1st expiration for you to see. And you can run in a query and look at anyone with that code. And depending on your college, I mean, you may have 0 or, it's some of the smaller rural colleges of these. I talked about statutory grace period. The law provides that if a student is enrolled and you become aware, they've told you, oh, my family just moved out of state. I'd like to keep taking online courses, or I'm going to stay behind. Okay. If the student is already enrolled, the student can stay at that tuition rate for up to 12 months. They have a grace period. in which time they're either establishing residency in the other state or they're trying to establish independent residency here. Okay. You need to coordinate these with RDS, and again, there's a chapter in the responsibility guide for campuses that walk you through how to do that. So if the family moved February 1st and you found out about it today and they told you, yeah, it was effective February 1st, then it would be a year from February 1st. But they could stay on until that date in their in-state tuition rate. There's also a provision that if someone leaves the state like that, but then returns within 12 months, RDS will coordinate with it that they wouldn't lose their status. So someone says, oh, I've always wanted to move to California and let me just go ahead and do it. And they're out there 3 or 4 months and say, oh, it's too expensive and I can't find a job, and they move back. There is a way to coordinate that. And if we can show that they have truly moved back, they wouldn't lose their duration and they'd be okay. So there are all kinds of provisions in here. And I had one of the community colleges call me about, a couple of these recently. I mean, it's probably best to, when you get these unusual things, we could talk it through together, because I know you won't get them very often. Notice that it applies to residency determination. Okay, anytime because they would switch to an exception for that grace period. So you need to notify RDS and that they would lose their grants after that point. Grants will not recognize any kind of exception. You must fully meet the residency criteria. You may be called upon to deal with tuition waivers. RDS doesn't directly. All RDS does is it will let you know in a couple of cases they're claiming they have something, like, for example, the ward of the state, the people who were in foster care who turn 18, there's a provision, I think it's through age 23, they may be eligible for tuition waiver. So all RDS is going to do is pass on, for the most part, their residency. So if they have a tuition waiver, that's a separate issue, kind of more on the financial aid side that RDS doesn't handle, but you will use the RDS determination because most of them require that they be a North Carolina resident currently. But sometimes we get questions about that. So when RDS makes a determination, certain data fields are passed on. We don't pass on every single bit of information. You don't see documents and things like that, but we utilize codes. And one of them is informational exception flags. And some campuses are very proactive and run lists and look at this. For example, if the student tells us they're non-resident, but I'm a veteran and I have a benefit and I plan to use it, RDS will flag that as veteran exception with the code VetX for informational purposes. We haven't verified because we don't know if they have a benefit. Is there still anything left? They may have used it one more semester and it would be expired today. There's no guarantee for future. Likewise, if they say they are a family member or UNC system employee. So there's certain informational flags. If they tell us, RDS passes it on for information. Likewise, that one tracking that we talked about, non-immigrant tracking for time-limited visas, would be passed on in that information exception flag. Resources, there's a lot out there. First of all, for the public and for students, on our public website, as I said, there are lots of Q&As. There's a summary of the requirements. There's the actual RDS guidebook, which is the official document detailing the law, and it's referenced, legally, and all the requirements and procedures and policies we follow. All the eligibility, for example, there's a whole section there in immigration that talks about all the eligible statuses. There is a call center unique for students. It's open till 6 o'clock. During peak periods, especially before fall registration, they're open till 8 p.m. They will help the student. They can get in there, see if they're stuck, if they don't know how to answer a question, want to know next steps. Students can always call and get assistance. They also have an email. Okay. So they handle those general questions for the student. I don't remember my password, wondering next steps. They could ask for what's the best way to do X, Y, and Z because of my situation, and they could speak to someone live, or they can email. This is that public website. There are a bunch of categories here. As I say, there's also a lot of one-pagers for students. counselors, parents about unique circumstances, FAQs, a lot of information out there. Like that chart I showed you earlier about what information do we use, what does FAFSA use, and to be prepared coming into this. A lot of high school counselors use that during college app season to help them prepare for this when they come in. For the campus, we have a dedicated campus support line, okay? And this gives you that information as well as a dedicated email. And please don't give this to students, because we want to be available to help you and support you when you have a student in front of you or you've come up, with a unique situation. This goes to the processing staff that actually work on those reconsiderations and appeals and so forth. And they'll help with general questions specific about a student, troubleshooting. Also on the public website, there is a link at the bottom. This gives you the password to some other like campus manual. We're going to email these after this presentation, by the way, the guidebook and the campus manual. We'll talk about that. So that's unique for the campus. And my contact information is here. If you're talking about official policy guidance, we publish the RDS guidebook and campus guides. Anything about campus-based exceptions or tracking responsibilities, those unique campus-based things, the RDS staff is not well-versed on it. They know basically it, but if you have questions about any of those, I would be your best contact for that. Please feel free anytime. If you just get an unusual scenario, every once in a while, it's hard to remember all this. Granted, I know. The only reason I think I've finally mastered some of this is our sheer volume. Since we've gone live, which was December 2016, we've had over 1.6 million unique students come through. Like last year, we had some like 60,000 new students. So even more determinations. We've had, no, sorry, more than that last year, because we've had 304,000 come through so far this year. No, sorry, 34, sorry. Anyway, so sheer volume, after a while, you see all scenarios, and if there is a way we can, basically, so because I understand community college students are different from UNC students. I've worked in all three sectors. I can appreciate that. Basically, what we train the staff is that if it looks like everyone's always been here, there's no hint that someone has just moved here or another state involved or 2 states or 3 states, we go with that and look for just what we need to document it. If it looks like there's 2 states and one might be a secondary home, then we are probably looking a little closer. So they're going to do their best, as will I, to find any way to qualify a student if at all possible. Happy to work with you on that. And that is a whirlwind tour through the world of residency.
Do we have any questions or comments?
I see there's a question there about using XRDS. If you go to, and Monty can give you details how to access that resource site with all the system documents. There are 2 documents in there you want pertaining to residency. One is kind of a troubleshooting, and one of them is general setup and how to use each one of the screens, including processes for continuous enrollment and so forth.
Okay, I'll get that out to everyone. Also, if you have any additional questions, just email me and I'll make sure that, or email Gene. He'll be glad to answer your questions also. Or I can get them to Jesse Cross or JW. Maybe they can answer some of the ones you may have. So just let us know, and I'll make sure you get a response. Does someone have a question? Sarah Brennan asks, CCP student, the residency will recalculate, cannot register student, any information on how to get it to recalculate?
Okay, so here's where I'll be dangerous enough to give you some information, verify it. But so when you have a student who's CCP students, or the, what is it, NC? apprenticeship NC, right? They're not required to come through RDS unless they're usually not seeking enrollment outside of that CCP umbrella. Once they're going to be, if they're applying for graduation after that CCP career is going to end, they would have to come to RDS. So they're not required to. What you're going to have to do is, if that same student is transitioning, okay, to curriculum in a term, you have to go in and ensure that their CCPP or whatever it is type is end dated, and you are admitting them as a curriculum student for it to calculate correctly. If anybody else is online, I see a couple of you have experience, can chime in, but that's a big tricky thing, that you have to end their career, including those other screens, what is it, XNC 1.2 or XNC or whatever, about showing their high school graduation, ending the CCP, but more importantly, the student type has to be changed. Yeah, the CCP type, the date may be different by campus, so don't use someone else's date. You've got to end it when their career they have finished, and you're starting. You have to admit them as a curriculum student. And I see Ms. Joanna Brown, who's probably more expert than I, has another suggestion about updating CE on the XRDS screen. Yep, IASU graduation date. You have to basically end their high school career and then admit them as a, yep. Sarah, what I would do is look in those documents that I referenced in the reference center about RDS. If that doesn't, you may want to reach out.
I will send it out to Jesse.
Yeah.
Sarah, send email to Jesse Cross if you can't figure out, and also let Sonia know. Also, Sonia Bartley.
Okay, so there was one question here about an applicant who didn't use any unique number. It is possible that they used, yep, and we tell them this. We've had one or two that absolutely don't want to give it, and we've told them to check with the college because they're not going to see anything at the other end. It is possible for them to use a high school ID to get through that, but yeah. Carl, if you have, if you could email me or call me, I will see if I can puzzle that out with you, what we're going to do. Yeah, when you have someone like that, non-citizen. I know this is a lot, folks, if you're new, but residency law is in an effort to, I think, provide lots of pathways for students, can be very complicated at times, but please feel free to reach out, that campus line, or contact me. And, when you have, these circumstances, I'd be very happy to try to help.
Any other questions? All right, Gene, thank you for giving us a session this morning. Everyone else, thank you for taking your time to be on. I am going to go ahead and stop recording now.
If I could mention one